Good evening.
Hi.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see all of you. It's my distinct pleasure, actually, to introduce Antoinette Lattouf. Maybe some of you have seen her in a very well-received debate a couple nights ago with Shashi Tharoor and Sanjay Jha, which I'm told she won. I didn't see it, but apparently she and her partner won that debate. So she is, as you just heard, a well-known Australian journalist, not an Australian cricketer, but an Australian. A lot of us in India think Australia and then we think cricket. So
I'm terrible at
you're
sport.
terrible at
Terrible at
sports?
sport.
Okay. All right. Well, a lot of your countrymen are not, so
That's
that
correct.
makes you a minority
That's
right
correct.
away.
Again.
Yeah. Okay. So I wish I actually had this book to show you, but I was sent a PDF, so I didn't.
Yes.
And I don't know if are there any copies of the book, Sharadia? No, we don't have any copies. Okay. Well, anyway, it's called as I think you said, how to lose friends and influence white people, which is that title is taken from a relatively famous
Very
book.
famous.
Yes,
Dale
by
Carnegie.
Dale Carnegie's book. Yeah, but I think they're slightly different. These two books.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so I think actually, or I know this book was written as a reaction to a claim that's often made about Australia, that it is the world's most successful multicultural nation. And there are a lot of Australians who disagree with that. And for example, the cricket writer Gideon Hay once said, he wrote of a staunch and obvious Anglo-centricity. I mean, he was talking about something else, but that is what he was referring to in the kind of attitudes in Australia. And so I feel like Antoinette's effort in this book is to show, or to at least ask if that claim about multiculturalism stands up to the bullshit test. And you have somebody that she interviewed who says, no, it doesn't, and no, we aren't. Right? So and I think the book tries to expand on that. So, Antoinette, what I want to do is just shoot some questions about you that were spurred in me by the book, and let's see how you respond. That's all. So let me start actually with something that's not in the book, but it's a tragedy that's been in the news of late in Australia. The murder of a young man called Cassius Turvey, is that his name? Is that how you pronounce it? So this is a 15-year-old who was named after actually the original name of the boxer Muhammad Ali, Cassius. And about a month ago, maybe mid-October, Cassius and his friends were walking back from school in Perth, and there was a car that approached them, and some guys jumped out of the car and started running after these boys and attacked two of them, one with the crutches that he was carrying because he was injured with something else, and one, Cassius, with a metal pole, and they beat him to death. So this is, from what I've read, this murder has raised hard questions in Australia about what racism really is, and I'd like to just ask if you would expound on that, Antoinette. Tell us a little bit about these, and what are these questions about pervasive racism that this incident raises?
Cassius is an Aboriginal boy, he's an Indigenous boy, and it's not uncommon for Indigenous people to face disproportionate levels of violence, either from police within their own community or from these men were yelling out racial slurs when they attacked this boy. It's a tragedy, but I think the bigger tragedy is that it wasn't covered in the news for a few weeks after it happened. He was hospitalised, and it wasn't covered for at least a couple of weeks, then he died. Then when the police commissioner was asked about it, rather than frame it as in, this was a racist, violent attack, it was couched in the terms of, this boy happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, as though he was walking home from school, like where else should he have been? And that it was a case of mistaken identity, that they were trying to kill another black boy. And so that just got a lot of Indigenous people and other people of colour really frustrated, because the inherent racism that Australia faces is not just in these horrific acts of violence, it's in our institutions like the policing response, how the media covers race-based issues. And that's what I speak a lot about, because I am part of the mainstream media. I have worked in television and radio and online, and despite the fact that our country is so multicultural, I was the first woman from an Arabic-speaking background to work in commercial television. In Australia, people who hail from Indian or were born in India, in 5 years' time, it's going to be the most common place of birth for Australians outside of Australia, overtaking England for the first time. Yet you'd be very hard-pressed to find someone with Indian heritage who's on our screens. I probably know 2 Indian journalists in a country of 25 million. So there are those structural barriers, and of course that then impacts the way we report on minorities, the way we report. So there was a few years ago, you may have realised there was, you may have heard in Melbourne in particular, a lot of violence towards Indian international students. The way in which that is couched and spoken about, the blaming of victims rather than actually calling out, this is abhorrent racism, demonstrates just how much the media is part of the problem. And that's what I've tried to challenge in my work as both a broadcaster and an author and a diversity advocate, saying that we are an enormous part of the problem. And if we're not held accountable, and if we're not representative, how then can we hold those police commissioners accountable who say things like, the poor boy who was walking home from school was at the wrong place at the wrong time, rather than saying this is a horrendous attack against a black child who's innocent and should have made it home safely.
Can you just also tell our audience just quickly what is, so the book is, you again and again refer to Aboriginals and Torres Strait
Islanders.
So who are these people?
So the original custodians of our land are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. When the British colonised, there was widespread massacre, and over the years they've been, through deliberate strategies, deliberate policies to try and breed out black communities, the stolen generations, taking children from their families, putting them into white families. There have been policy after policy which has been deliberately framed to eradicate Indigenous Australians. Then there's disease and alcohol and a range of other ways in which they've been incredibly disenfranchised. Indigenous Australians now account for about 3% of our population. The reason I talk about anti-blackness in our treatment of Indigenous people, because they are the foundation. So any people, other people of colour who come into Australia, we're sold the dream that it's a great multicultural country, you work hard, you'll get ahead, but you enter a country that has a legacy of anti-blackness, has a legacy of treating people of colour badly. And unless we reconcile that, we can't expect people, if you were to move to Australia, for you to be treated fairly, or communities like mine to be treated fairly in the country. And so I guess I wanted to test the difference between the rhetoric and the reality when it comes to Australia and fairness.
So one more thing about this incident about Cassius Turvey. You know, some of the reports I read said they had this heading at the top that said, "Warning for Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander readers. This article carries images of someone who has died."
Yes.
So why would they carry that?
That is a cultural sensitivity because for many Indigenous communities, if someone has passed, it is not acceptable, or it's offensive to either use their name or use their image. And so those warnings are for Indigenous communities, just so that should they choose not to. Usually you have to ask for permission if somebody has passed to continue to use their names, just based on their belief system of the afterlife. And so that's why those warnings are in place.
So is that a sensitivity that's come about recently?
Yeah, and not all outlets would do it. The public broadcasters will. And so it is a sensitivity issue where since Black Lives Matter, some outlets are trying to be more sensitive and more aware. Okay.
I was also struck by a few lines from your book, and I'm going to, many lines in the book, but so I'm going to just again toss some out at you and just explain them to our audience, okay? So here's one. I'm quoting you here. It might just be a casual intellectual chat about race, but for a lot of black people and people of color, this is not an intellectualized casual conversation. It is a lived experience that can be fraught with a lot of pain.
Yes.
So can you tell us what you're getting at there?
What often happens, and I guess this is why this book is written for, people of colour. So I talk about, Indigenous people and other people of colour, because we all have a role to play in being anti-racist. I'm continually challenging myself to challenge we live in structures, and so does India in many ways, because of the colonial hangover, so to speak, where whiteness is seen as supreme, and all actions are measured against good, which is often equated with white. And so when you live in a society where black is bad and white is good, we all have work to do. Often when there are things in politics or in the media like Cassius's murder, like Black Lives Matter, like the assaults on Indian international students, like there's a lot of anti-Arab, anti-Islamic sentiment post-September 11.
Yeah.
There was the race riots in Australia against Middle Eastern people. Often people then who are not impacted by, who are not ethnic minorities, want to talk about racism or want to talk about, oh, does this really happen? I don't understand it. In the book, I try and put the onus back on the majority, that it is your job to do research, get educated. And often when you speak to people who have been the subject of discrimination, who have constantly experienced systemic racism, daily microaggressions, racist outbursts, it's not just a bit of a discussion. It taps into, especially for Indigenous Australians, it taps into generations of trauma. Many Indigenous people will have a grandmother who was stolen, taken from the Indigenous family and put into a white family. That sort of trauma lives on.
Yeah.
And so just because Cassius, for example, has died, calling up an Indigenous person or a brown person or a black person just to have a chat is not necessarily just a casual chat.
Yeah.
It's really taxing. It's really tiring. It's really unfair. And that's why with this why I guess why I've written the book is a how-to manual with pointers on what people can do to do the work themselves. And
in fact, that I'm going to come back to that about the
Yes.
how-to manual. But
Yeah.
so you use this word microaggressions, the
Yes.
systemic racism. So give us some examples of that.
less and less so, I'm not sure in an Indian context, but in Australia, there are less overt instances of discrimination. You're less likely to be called, a stupid Lebanese person or a stupid Indian or an N-word. You're less likely to have those overt. Sometimes, yes, especially since COVID, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment where more and more it's couched in sort of backhanded compliments, hidden by humour, comments that are kind of after a couple of seconds where you're told you're a credit to your race, or oh, you're one of the good ones, you've turned out okay, or commended for how well you speak the English language. Or, for example, even when I wanted to study journalism at school, after school I went to my careers advisor, I was told to aim lower. And maybe try and attend the community. Aim lower, and to maybe go to the community college instead. All of those kind of assaults on who you are and where you should be in the pecking order.
Yeah.
They're microaggressions. So one isolated incident where someone makes a comment about curry or whatever and has a little laugh with that on its own might not be awful, but it's the cumulative impact of constantly having to justify yourself or feel that you're worth, even in working in commercial television, it's the way in which it's framed, or you're there because you're the diversity hire or you're the minority hire. They need some minorities. So it's not about credit or skill, it's about a box ticking exercise. So microaggressions build up, and they're like tiny little cuts to dignity that over time really have impact.
So have you ever looked at or seen parallels to this country that you're in the kind of things that you're talking about?
I think what there are a few. Obviously, the countries are very different, but what is the same is that the legacy of anti-blackness and whiteness is supreme. We see it in beauty standards, we see it in beauty products, we see it in Bollywood, the depiction of, or the fact that there's a whole market for skin lightening products. There is a definite correlation between white being better and browner being worse. I see that as I think class plays a bigger role in India. There are much larger class divides. Whereas in Australia, I think the middle class is a larger cohort than here. But despite that, money in Australia doesn't. So you could be a very wealthy Asian person or a very wealthy Middle Eastern person, but you're still, or a very educated Middle Eastern person. But when you look at our judiciary, our government, our media, you're still locked out of those pillars of democracy. You can have 12 degrees. And you can have a healthy bank balance, but you still don't have access to those power institutions. I'm not sure if that's the case in India.
Some degree. There are situations like you said about, for example, what did this remind me of? There was there's a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric that we hear.
Yes.
And sometimes people will say, yeah, but he's a good Muslim.
Yes.
And he's a patriotic Muslim. And we are only against the anti-national Muslims. And you wonder, what does that mean actually? Who's defining who's the anti-national Muslim? Or what gave you the right to decide who's anti-national or who's not, and on what basis did you decide that? And Muslims have to fight that battle all the time, and exactly like you're saying, these microaggressions all the time. So
and I understand during COVID as well, there was increased resentment, sometimes racist attacks towards Indians in the northeast, Mongoloid,
people who look Chinese. Yeah, so yes, there was
Asian appearing.
Yes,
yes.
I don't want to talk about it at length, but the book that I wrote is about that whole issue, and it's about how people who were seen that as Chinese, who look Chinese, are always being associated with China, and we have a history of hostility with China. There's a border dispute that we've never resolved, and so that goes on and on. So every time there's a little flare up on the border, that people who look Chinese get attacked in different ways. They're shouted at in trains, or they're kicked out of their apartments in Bangalore and things like that. So that goes on. And again, that's why I wanted to pick up on that word microaggression, because I'm not even sure they're micro sometimes.
Yes, I know. Micro sounds as though they're small, but they're often not.
They're not. Yeah.
But it's more that they're covert and routine, and sometimes couched in casual humor or passing comments.
Yeah.
The thing about this book, which would be relevant to Indians, is that we all have to challenge racist beliefs. And just because you are not white does not make you exempt from having discriminatory attitudes and discriminatory behaviour. And one of the things I explore, where there is not a lot of literature in Australia, is that there is a lot of anti-blackness amongst other people of colour.
Other people of colour, yes.
So there's racism within cultural minorities. And I found it even within the Arabic-speaking communities during Black Lives Matter, anti-black attitudes, or people who were trying to get more closer to
the whites.
If we join them, if we can't beat them, we'll join them. And so we'll assume some of that behaviour, and we'll be part of those systems rather than challenge them. And I've even had bust-ups within my own community when I call things out, because I'm like, we were at the receiving end of unfairly being targeted by police, having huge amounts of moral panic in the media. If ever I told anybody I was Lebanese, they'd go, oh, okay, oh, you must be one of the good ones, like constantly, or being ashamed of to actually to tell people my ethnic origins. I'm like,
you felt that at one point?
Absolutely, for years and years and years. So going out in Sydney, my husband is here with my brothers, and my husband who's brown-skinned, and my brothers with beards, and trying to get into a bar, and they, no Arabs allowed. We were these every weekend. And so these are the sorts of things we experience. So I'm like, how can you be at the receiving end of discrimination and then be happy to perpetuate it? Because there is a belief that if the attention is off us, and we make things worse for somebody else, and it's almost a human survival instinct. Cultures have done that for eons.
For eons, yes.
And what I'm trying to espouse is that we need to challenge those systems.
So actually, my wife is here too, and I have a small story that matches that with your. Is that your husband? Then?
That's my husband over here.
So we were with a German friend some years ago, and we were going to this bar in downtown Bombay, and she and I were dressed in Indian clothes. She was in a sari, and I was dressed in a kurta pajama, if you know what that is. And our German friend was dressed, in a probably like I am now. And we get to this bar, and they allowed him in, but they would not allow us in. And so, of course, all of us came back, but we couldn't understand that. There was some dress code that did not allow Indian clothes. And it just totally baffled us. But that's the kind of thing that sometimes you have here.
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, getting back to this interesting book, here's another line that I read, and I want you to talk about it. Being anti-racist isn't a favor to us, but rather the bare minimum that white people owe. Can you tell us a little bit? And I want you to talk about. I want you to talk actually about how white people react to being told that.
Yeah, look, I mean, the reactions have been different, but I haven't been cancelled yet, which is good. I'm still around. I just think that there needs to be a shift in, if we live in the country, we pay our taxes, we contribute to the economy. This isn't some kind of pity payback.
Yes.
If we want to celebrate the nation for the thriving multicultural nation, it absolutely is, and we deserve respect. It's not something that we should thank you for. And
we just deserve respect for just being.
For just being, and also based on the fact that Australia is on stolen land.
Yeah.
They've effectively almost wiped out the indigenous population. This was not your land to begin with, to start with, to control and to protect and to defend from other people of colour. And so some of my lines are confronting. The very title of my book is cheeky and confronting. But I think that the conversations need to happen. And I think there is an appetite, there is a recognition that we need to do better. I mean, Black Lives Matter saw people who didn't want to think about Indigenous deaths in custody. So yes, it was very much something that everybody paid attention to because of George Floyd in the United States. But what it did in Australia was make people who were very good at looking away, forced us to look at the Indigenous deaths in custody that we have in Australia, which are a lot and often not reported in the media.
And they're percentage-wise much higher than like per capita custody deaths.
Oh, absolutely. For example, in Australia, the fastest growing prison population is black women, Indigenous women. They're 33 times more likely to be in prison than a white person. An Indigenous woman is 10 times more likely to die at childbirth than a white woman. Something like 25 times more likely to be hospitalised for domestic violence than a white woman, live 10 years less than a white. Like the inequality markers are they're just there. We just choose to look away and to not talk about it.
So how does this is what I want to get at. How does a white guy or white woman who reads this but who's never really thought of herself as racist, and then suddenly she's confronted with a line like this, a book like this, and starts to think about what's inside me that might resonate with this?
Well, I have heard from a lot of readers. I've heard from like middle-aged white men who've read my book and send me a note. I think in it, because I talk about my own fallibility, my own realizations of the fact that I too have had times when I have been a good ally to Indigenous people, where I have had to challenge my own views, and the admission that we all are racist. It's hard to uncondition ourselves, because this is not just about how individuals think, it's about how we operate in a society where our structures are formed in a certain way. So yes, that line on its own is quite confronting, but I think by the time people get to that part in the book, it's a bit of a journey going, okay, this is not individual, it's not about your feelings necessarily, it's about what we can all do to challenge a system that we were born into, and that we don't have a choice whether we come into this world as black or white or male or female or straight or disabled, or it's just about acknowledging where you are and thinking, what can I do from my platform? What can I do to make things better?
Okay, so then I want to go on and ask you about this guy called Brenton Tarrant.
Oh, yes.
Who, this Australian man whom you may all remember slaughtered Muslims in Christchurch in New Zealand. There's a whole section in your book which actually starts with, you find yourself yelling bloody white people.
Yes.
And that's prompted by this man. So, prompted by
the media
coverage. So again, would you explain to us why and what the issues were that were raised by that?
So Brenton Tarrant is the murderous terrorist who took over 50 lives. He's part of the growing neo-Nazi white supremacist threat in Australia. Our security agency now spends most of its time on that terror threat. For so long, we were warned about Islamic terrorism, terrorists from the Middle East, which in many ways impacted the way people with a Middle Eastern background were treated in Australia. And then this horrible crime is committed by this white man in his late 20s who was radicalised online, who's had a plan, and his plan was to kill as many Muslims as possible. And the media framing of what he did compared to the moral panic over what somebody might do, there was so much reportage of people of Muslim or Middle Eastern background, not necessarily even linked to a crime. Mm-hmm. And then here is this man who has committed these awful crimes, and they would put on the front page a picture of him as a toddler and describe him as a blue-eyed, curly-haired toddler. Like, what does that have to do with the fact that he has killed 50-something people, and saying that his father died of cancer, that he was well-liked as a personal trainer, and described that he grew up in a weatherboard home, and all of this language which made you humanised him and maybe sympathised with him.
So let me ask whether descriptions of, let's say, the guys who flew into those planes into 9/11 on similar lines?
Absolutely. Just imagine they described some of those terrorists who were absolutely horrible human beings as, a toddler with a lovely laugh. When he was younger, he was a toddler with a lovely laugh, and he was a good carpenter. Would you have cared to have known that the person who flew into the World Trade Center was a good carpenter once upon a time? And I realised that this was a problem because of it was uncomfortable for those who are in the media, which is absolutely overwhelmingly dominated by white people, disproportionately, given that half of Australia's population were either born overseas or has a parent who was born overseas. But it made them uncomfortable to confront the fact that terrorism in the country is white. And I said that, I was on a primetime evening show, a panel show, and the host was a blonde, a handsome blonde man in his 30s, and I said, the modern face of terrorism is you. That's
He took that real well?
He did, because he knows me, he did. I was like, it's you, but it's just something that we don't want to confront in this country. Wow. And actually globally, white supremacy and neo-Nazism is the fastest growing threat.
I mean, I'd like to suggest to you guys and you too that there's a recent parallel in India. You will know the number of rapists and murderers were released in Gujarat on August 15th, and without completing their time in prison, and they were garlanded and they were given sweets when they were released from prison, and a local politician called them sanskari Brahmins. Sanskari means cultured Brahmins, and that politician, by the way, has been given a ticket in the upcoming assembly election in Gujarat. So these things get their rewards, So, I mean, that's also why I asked you earlier if you've thought about parallels in India, So, but anyway, the thing that maybe puzzled me about your book is something that you alluded to earlier, that it at one level it's like a primer on racist attitudes and that many of us may have internally, and you're talking to white people unknowingly, internally, whatever it is. But on the other hand, it's almost like a self-help book about how do you combat these attitudes? How do you, as a indigenous person or a person of color, combat these attitudes? How do you counter them? How do you counter racism? So was that conscious? And
absolutely.
Is there a particular characterization that you wanted to give the book, or was it both of these that you wanted to get to?
Well, what has happened in Australia in particular, and I think with any social change movement, whether it's feminism, whether it's whatever, any global movements, even whether they're national or global, it's tough being a change maker. It's not easy criticising power institutions. It's often with consequence to career, to safety, to well-being. And so I wanted to ensure that while I spoke about the scale of the problems and things that needed to be done, that I was also really honest about what could happen, the pushback you could get at a personal level, be that relationship breakdowns, loss of jobs, threats to safety, because that's what has happened, particularly in an Australian context. People before me, and I spoke about a couple of those examples, the Indigenous football player, a Muslim Sudanese writer, a Japanese Australian journalist, certain things when they try to use their platform to challenge racism, the disproportionate way they were handled. I mean, Yasmin Abdul Majid, the Sudanese author, was effectively driven out of the country.
She now lives in England.
The footballer was a famed footballer, Australian of the Year.
He was booed for years.
Booed until he stopped. Booed for seasons until he stopped working. So you're effectively silenced. And so this was as much a book about for people who want to champion to be less racist themselves and do the work, but also for people who want to be change makers to go, well, these are some of the things you can do to preserve your mental health, to think about your careers, to even think about your in writing the book, there are people I'm no longer friends with.
Yeah.
There are career avenues that have been blocked off. And it's just about going in eyes wide open to best know how to navigate those challenges.
Okay. The footballer story was particularly sad. I went to look, what is his name?
Adam Goods.
Adam Goods. So Adam Goods is an Australian football player who, Aussie rules, right? That's
Aussie
what it's
rules.
called, right? And there was this time when he was, running along and about to score, and a young girl in the audience called out,
teenager.
Shouted out ape, called him an ape. And so he immediately stopped and pointed at her, and she was taken out. But the reaction he faced was that over the next, 2 or 3 seasons till he retired,
Yes.
or left the game, he was booed at every game.
But it was the commentary, it was the media commentary, it was the political rhetoric, especially because this particular round was the Indigenous round. It was a round to try and celebrate Indigenous culture. He had been part of an anti-racism campaign with the Human Rights Commission. He had been named Australian of the Year. He had won the Brownlow Medal, which is the highest honour in this football. He was loved until he called out racism. And even after that incident, he had said, I don't blame that girl. People need to be educated. We don't know what kind of household she grew up in. But, I just think we need to call out racism. And then oh my gosh, the commentary, the columns, the broadcasters, and then he was effectively booed until he retired.
Yeah. I thought you said you didn't like sports.
I like politics and sport.
Okay. So, I have 2 final questions before we ask the audience if they have.
Sure.
So one is, I really want, like I had mentioned earlier, I would like you to tell the audience a story about a viewer who wrote to your TV channel about something that she noticed about you. I mean, it has nothing to do with the book, but I really think it's a very lovely story. So please.
This is really interesting because Dilip, in reading my book, realised that my name was familiar and wasn't sure how he was familiar with me and my story. And I think this happened during the pandemic when people were looking for stories of hope and kindness. I was working at a television network at the time on a breakfast television program. And after I got off air, there was a note, I think it came via Facebook to the network, with a grandmother from a regional part of Australia said, there's a lump on Antoinette's throat. I think she should check it out. I think there's something wrong with her thyroid. And then the editor called me over and said, we've got this note. I went back and I had a look at the footage, and I realised that when I turned my neck, was talking to my panellist, there was a big lump on my throat. Anyway, I went to the doctors that afternoon. It turned out it was a big cyst. I had surgery. I took it. I found I had an autoimmune disease, and it was all because of this wonderful woman. But there was something about that woman's act of kindness that just
went viral.
People loved the fact that a stranger took a moment to reach out, and nobody saw it. My husband never realised. The makeup artist who put makeup on it didn't realise.
You didn't realize?
Like this.
You didn't realize?
I didn't realise. I didn't even know I had it. And so then I was in surgery a couple of weeks later, and
And you're okay now?
I'm okay now. Yes.
So I have a parallel there. See, I have a scar here. So I had a lump here too, which was removed, but that was when I was 6 years old. So
right. Okay. There we are.
I get asked about that, and I tell people that I was in this fight in a dark lane, and I was chasing this woman, and this other guy, her boyfriend came after me, and also. But
much more interesting
much
story.
More interesting story. Yeah. Okay, and the last question I want to ask you is, I would like you to name all your 96 cousins. Can you do that now? First cousins, can you name them?
Would you really like me to?
But you know all the...
I do. I have, my mum's one of 14 and my dad's one of 13. And so I have 96 first cousins. So
and you know all their names?
I do know all of their names.
Okay.
I do confuse some of them. Some of them have the same names. There are a few Musas, a few Josephs.
Okay.
Yes, but I do. Very large family.
Okay, well, I won't hold you to that. So would anyone like to ask Antoinette any questions? Are we okay on time? Okay, so...
It's always the first one. People are a bit sheepish when it comes to the first question.
Somebody?
Hi.
I guess, thank you for speaking today. What I feel like often the racist undertones that you're talking about, there are a lot of parallels to the States or to England, where, you know, settler, especially the States, right, a settler colonial society.
Are you from the States, Adam?
I am from the States, yes.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about how in the Australian context, what is the nuances of how white supremacy manifests itself that is uniquely Australian? And obviously I haven't read the book, but like
Yes.
that maybe kind of is different in like how like Black Lives Matter maybe called out different
Yeah, absolutely.
nuances.
So I think a couple of things. In the United States, for example, you have a larger visibly black population. So I think it's about 15% of the population is black. You have a large Hispanic population, so you're minority, majority. Soon Australia will be minority, majority in about 5 years' time. Because of the systemic breeding out of Indigenous people, many have my skin colour. Some would be your skin colour. And so often they're less visibly different, but the level of disadvantage and the circumstances within which they live are distinctly Indigenous. When I talk about white supremacy, yes, it's a growing neo-Nazi threat, but our institutions are even more white. So in the book I do comparisons. So if I was to turn on CNN or Fox or whatever, you see black, Asian, Hispanic faces. I started a not-for-profit 5 years ago called Media Diversity Australia because at that time, when you put on the television screens of every network, so, you know, when you're at the gym and there's all the TV next to each other, or the airport, every single person was Anglo. And that is a uniquely Australian experience. That is not the US, the UK, Canada, that's not kosher. That would just not happen. Similarly, our Supreme Court is 100% white. Our ASX 300, 200 companies, our stock exchange, only 5% are not white. So when you look at our big power institutions, they are incredibly white. They have the stronghold on power. And so on the one hand, we go, oh, Australia's got so many Indians, so many Asians, so many Middle Easterners, amazing, amazing, we're so multicultural. We are at a very surface level, but our power institutions are still very, very white.
Is that changing? I mean, do you see, if you go to a gym now, would you see some non-white
Well, now
faces?
we have, since we started Media Diversity, so we have 2 Indigenous people on breakfast television shows. Okay. The conversation has moved along. Our latest political party, we have a Chinese deputy prime minister, which was unthinkable, a few years ago. We're still far behind, say, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, in terms
even
of...
New Zealand? Yeah.
Even New Zealand.
So what has New Zealand done right that Australia
New Zealand has done a few things. There's been an acknowledgement by some major media outlets, like a public apology and acknowledgement of historical entrenched racism in their reporting. Okay. They've come out and made that admission. They also have Maori language throughout bulletins. Yeah. So they've acknowledged their Indigenous people. They have better representation on screens, and they have a more progressive prime minister, a female prime minister. Yes. Even their response to the Christchurch terror attacks was very empathetic. Was very, and so I just think there are just pockets of examples where New Zealand's done better. I mean, the United States, for example, you might have more black faces on screens than we do, but did you have massive problem with black deaths in custody? So I mean, it's not as though more screens on television solve your problems, but at least during Black Lives Matter, there were black people to talk about it. In Australia, they sent all white people to talk about Black Lives Matter. Like, it's just it's strange. Like, even if there was another big attack on Indian international students in Melbourne, they probably don't have an Indian journalist to cover it in Australia. Yeah? They wouldn't. Okay. And it just doesn't make sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, Naresh?
So I was thinking about the difference between bigotry and discrimination in Australia and India. I think it's perhaps contained in this title, Impolitely Correct. There's a recognition, I think, in Australia that you're still working within the framework of civil conversation, civil discourse, and that to be discriminatory in this way is something to be embarrassed about. I think what we face in India is the fact that nobody recognizes. There is an assertion that discrimination is the correction of historical wrong. I think we're at the moment and moving back to the moment of the White Australia policy,
Right.
of entrenching discrimination in policy. And so I wanted to ask you, how did the White Australia policy get dismantled? Was it a result of sort of civil agitations, or?
Well, the White Australia policy was dismantled because Australia needed more migrants. So it was a populate or perish. They needed more workers. So it was dismantled in language, but not dismantled in attitude. And so it persisted until, as an actual policy, I believe, till the mid-90s. But it was a survival mechanism. Australia can't function without the level of migration. Even now, with the backlog of COVID, we have really low unemployment. We have mass staff shortages in anything from agriculture to IT to nursing. As a country, we cannot function. So it was by force of our very existence and need to grow that we allowed.
So it wasn't a sense that this is the right thing to do?
No, because even up until 3 years ago, the foreign minister would say things like, it was a mistake to let in the Lebanese into Australia. And there was a deputy prime minister who used language which was essentially Proud Boys languages, which have now been identified as a neo-Nazi group. So using openly white supremacist language. Yeah. So some policies have been diluted, but the sentiment and the attitudes very much remain. However, there isn't an admission, even though racism exists and it's perpetuated, it's not owned. And I don't know, maybe in India people, perhaps it's more like, yes, and this is the way it should be. People have those beliefs, but they just present it in a different way. They present it in a more politically palatable and correct way, but the behavior doesn't suggest they have those beliefs.
I think what my friend Naresh is also getting at is that it's become almost respectable now to express those things that you used to hide, to say those bigoted things.
Okay.
And it's almost like, this is the way it is, and I'm being straightforward and saying the things that should be said, and these people need to be put in their place. So various ways in which this language works, and that is I think a feature of the last few maybe last 20, 30 years.
Oh, okay. What do you think has shifted to?
I think it's just tapping into, honestly, I really think it's tapping into a deep hostility and resentment that a lot of us have carried and kept suppressed for a long time. And it's just now become, it's open season. You can say those things and people think that's okay.
Yeah, right.
So,
okay.
Forget the name of the columnist. Yeah, sorry. I'm Usha Subramanian. So when you do get people, the others, not the natives, into positions of power, etc., to expect any radical change from that is actually a bit, it's foolish, because to get there, very often they have to play the game the
like
white man's
UK.
way, right?
Yes.
In the UK, for example. Yes. So everyone was going gaga over an Indian.
Yes.
And everyone wanted to own him,
but he's
right?
pretty racist views and policies.
But actually he is more conservative than the Tory, I mean more Tory than the Tory, and very often, like even women in high positions, they have to be like men in order to survive, right? So on the one hand we say include, but inclusion alone is not the answer. Very often it becomes tokenism.
Yes.
So what do you have to say to that?
Yes, that's a really good point, because as you say, sometimes more women in boardrooms just mean they emulate male behaviour and they become part of the problem and nothing changes. That's the diversity part. So just getting more brown faces in politics is just the diversity part, unless there's a real shift in thinking. And that's where the inclusion. So often when we talk about diversity, this book is as much about racism as it is diversity, equity and inclusion. The inclusion part is when you actually are able and safe to bring in your ideas, your whole identity, and produce that in your work. That's what often falls short. As you say, for survival, you have to play the white man's game. And even for me, I finally left a television network earlier this year. I worked for myself, but for 15 years, I had to kind of shut my mouth a lot, work within the system to get to a point of power and privilege myself, where I can now work for myself and I actually say what I want, publish what I want, and operate as I want. But that's not always easy, because it's harder to stay employed and stay. Absolutely. But then power will come in numbers. So, you know, being the one brown person in the room or on the board, or the agreeable brown person who's in a conservative party who's really just more conservative than the white man, that's not going to bring about change. I think change comes within numbers, and change comes when the inclusion part happens. And that's when we're able and celebrated with all of our ideas, because this is not just about social cohesion and anti-racism. There's so much data and research that shows diverse organisations are more innovative, they're more profitable, they're better at responding to risk and identifying risk. Like, it's actually better for business, it's better for civil society, because you have a problem and you've got all these different people around the table coming at it with a solution. For some reason,
you make that point in the book that it's better for business.
It absolutely is. There's so much data, but for some reason, that alone isn't enough to convince people. But then that's because power is never willingly handed over, even if it's the right thing to do. People are uncomfortable with that. And as we know, with misinformation and COVID, data doesn't shift people's minds. Evidence doesn't necessarily convince people anymore.
Okay, 2 short comments. I totally agree with you, and I think each one of us has a responsibility to challenge and resist white supremacy and racism. Having said that, 2 comments. One, I think it is also a sad fact that there are shades of colors, and every shade exercises its supremacy and domination over the shade which is darker. And this is something we notice. We notice it in India, right from the north to the south. We have all the shades of skin, and each group is as bigoted and as conservative and as discriminatory as the other. So that's one comment. The second comment I want to make is, and this is true I think for all over the world, that indigenous communities have been treated with a great deal of disrespect, disregard, neglect, and humiliation, no matter what the color of their skin is. We have tribal communities in India whose skin colors are like ours. I mean, colors. They're like our colors. It's not there a matter of color. It is just a historic wrong that has been done to these communities, and that continues with absolutely, when I say absolutely, I'm not talking about 100 groups that may be working for their benefit, but with absolutely no regard from 98% of this country's population.
Similarly in Australia.
So the problem of the indigenous people or local people or whatever we choose to call them, indigenous has its own political connotation. We have different names for them, forest dwellers or whatever. But these are people who have been totally sort of, trampled upon and used and abused. So their category, I think, is a different question.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. And I think that's something I really raise in the book is I write about racism and diversity and inclusion. I am not an Indigenous person, and I have not faced the harm.
But they have.
No, absolutely not. And I was really mindful of that, because they don't need more people speaking for them and treading on them, because that has happened enough for too long, and for too long.
Okay.
Go. No, behind you.
So my question is regarding how do you classify Australia's media? Like here, basically in the last 10 years, we had a rise of what you can call the right-wing media. 10 years back, it was all left-wing liberal media with one particular point of view with the exclusion of the other side. So how would you define, because you mentioned Fox, so Fox would be, I would assume, right, but rest of the media, how would you define left, liberal, and will they be inclusive of the other ideologies? Because non-inclusion of
Yes.
Aboriginal people is okay.
Yes,
That is
yes.
also not okay in that sense. But were they inclusive of other ideologies also?
Yes, that's true, because diversity is diversity of thought. It's not just diversity of skin colour. Thankfully, Australia, we have some things working in our favour and others that are not. The thing that is working in our favour is we have 2 public broadcasters. The the ABC, for example, is wholly government funded, but by government funded, it's independent of the government. It's not a government propaganda arm. So the fact that we have a well-resourced, under conservative governments, they don't like to fund the ABC because they don't like the scrutiny it holds them up to. But now that we have a more progressive government in power, they're giving more money. So we have the ABC, which is incredibly important. However, we have some of the most concentrated media ownership in the Western world. Rupert Murdoch,
We haven't heard of him. We
The
don't-
Fox
no,
guy.
No.
The Fox guy.
About the Fox guy, about 70% of Australia's media is owned by Rupert Murdoch, which is populist, which is damaging, which is divisive, which is tabloid, and now he's newspapers in the regions, in the cities. He's got Sky News, which is trying to make a Fox News of Australia, radio station. So that is a real problem, and that is ideologically right. Up until about 6 months ago, climate change didn't exist, according to Rupert Murdoch. Then they made an admission, it actually does. Sorry about that. And so our biggest problem is when the Conservative government was in power about 15 years ago, they changed the media ownership laws to allow one person to own TV, television. And so in good news, The Guardian came from which is more progressive, and they've actually been able to be financially viable and profitable. It took 7 years for them to be profitable in
There's an
Australia.
Australian edition?
There's The Guardian Australia.
Okay.
But our biggest problem is that if we don't have the public broadcaster, we have Rupert Murdoch, and they're in a kind of an ideological culture war where if you're right wing, you say the ABC's too left wing, and then if you watch the ABC, you hate Rupert Murdoch, and it's just. And of course, then there's social media, which fuels that polarization. So it's not a very healthy ecosystem.
Kamala had a question.
You said that people or Australians used to consider themselves as ideal multicultural societies, but you showed how that there is a lot left to be achieved, and yet in terms of maybe because immigrants are necessary, they are there, and some level of awareness is there.
Yes.
Now, talking back to bigots, what is the factor that has helped you to achieve whatever has been achieved, whatever positives have been achieved? Is it purely because migrants have to be accommodated, or is it that the migrants have become articulate, and somewhere there was a note that what is the effective way of talking back to bigots? That
Yes.
was there somewhere in the
Yes.
literature. And so I wanted to know from you, what has been the effective way to talk back to bigots to achieve whatever you have achieved,
Yes.
however limited it may be?
Yes.
So how do you do it effectively?
For me, I have used the media as a platform and my voice as a journalist as a platform. So before I became a journalist, there wasn't a single person with an Arabic-speaking background who was in commercial television. And so by very virtue of me being there are a few others. Power in numbers, we began to speak on social media, write columns, and just having that support network. So if one goes, if the conservative press goes after you, you have some people in your corner. So largely I've used the media as an avenue to talk about these things. I started a not-for-profit called Media Diversity Australia, and over the past 5 years we've increased the number of people entering the media who are Indian, Chinese, Indigenous background, because again, those shifts come as you have more people in those positions. I mean, it's going to take time. 5 years is not enough time. So that's been my experience doing it because the media obviously is a megaphone for culture. You're able to reach audiences. You're able to ask questions of, I've been able to directly ask questions of the Prime Minister that somebody probably without my thinking and without my background wouldn't ask. For example, during the lockdowns, the harshest measures by police and public health officers, and even they sent the army in. They went to the low socioeconomic areas with the most brown people, and they had the most what's the word? Gosh.
Brutal? Or what is it?
Absolutely brutal and such overreach in what the power and control the government and the army exerted over those regions. And it was clearly based on hip pocket and colour of the skin. I was able to write about that and critique that because they're the communities that that's the community I hail
That you
from.
belong to, yeah.
You know, but without people like myself, who's going to write those columns? Who's going to ask those questions? So that's the way I have done it. The way in which everybody else talks to back to the bigots. I mean, I talk about it in my book. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve, and it depends what your platform is. I talk about everybody identifying what privilege they have, whether it's education, whether it's we all bring different things to this discourse, and I think it's really important to identify where you sit. I call it in the racial hierarchy, where you sit in the pecking order. Let's be real about where you sit, because even myself, I'm a woman with a Middle Eastern background, but I don't wear a hijab, I've got olive skin, I'm not black. Like, I know that I'm more palatable to certain audiences. What was that, sorry?
Very fair.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, well, there you are.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
Anyway, and so it's about identifying what is it that you want to achieve. Do you want to achieve shifts in health policy? Do you want to tackle deaths in custody? Do you want to education opportunities for women from Muslim communities? I think it's really important to find something that you can focus on or want to champion, because then you know which bigots exactly you're talking to. Otherwise, you're just kind of screaming out into the arena, hoping it will land, not sure what your message is.
Not so effective.
Yes.
So I'm going to exercise my privilege as the moderator to ask my mother to have the last question. So that's why I brought my mother.
Yes.
So we are almost out of time. So there you are.
This is this is just a comment. I visited New Zealand, and I was surprised to find that from the beginning, the Maoris, they're not referred to as originals, aboriginals. They are Maori people, and I think all the original people in the country should be referred to as, we have to admit it, as the early citizens of the country. Like in India, we say Adivasi, that the early livers in the country. In the same way, the Maoris are accepted. They have 15% in the 15% in the government.
The bureaucracy is
Not the bureaucracy.
Reservation.
In the
Parliament.
In the parliament.
Yes.
And everybody speaks Maori. Maori and English are the two accepted languages, and they seem to live happily with all this. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Yes, there is more. There's more social cohesion, and
it's
respect.
an amazing country, and all immigrants learn Maori and they readily speak it with English.
You know, a thing I noticed in your book and other things I read about Australia is that every now you refer to a particular Aboriginal, but now I don't remember the names, but you will say something
Tribes.
people.
Yes.
So
there's lots of different tribes. I think what's different, there's probably different dialects with the Maori language, but each tribe or indigenous peoples have their own language. There's hundreds and hundreds of indigenous tongues. Which is very, very fast erasing, and it's very hard to keep alive. But yes, if you're in Sydney, for example, they're the Gadigal people. But if you move to Melbourne, you're on different lands with different people. And
there's become almost tradition of acknowledging that.
Yes, in every public. Actually, at the beginning of if you and I were to begin this conversation, we would start, I would like to acknowledge your traditional custodians of the land. In Sydney, it would be the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, or the Gamaroi people of the... and you always acknowledge the traditional people.
Okay, good. Do we have time for...
One last.
Okay. So my mother didn't get the last word.
The world biggest problem is terrorism in the modern era or 21st century. So my question is how to finish terrorism across the world in the modern era?
How to
Finish.
Finish.
Oh gosh. I'd be a lot
Terrorism
richer
across the
if
world.
I knew could answer that. I mean, I don't have an answer or silver bullet. I do know that the internet's polarization is really fueling the whites. The rise of neo-Nazis. It's always, even when the terror threat around September 11 was largely from the Middle East or people of the Islamic faith, it tends to be the same cohort of people, young, disenfranchised men. So then there needs to be a range of interventions, from education to online monitoring of action, because it's these groups who don't feel heard, these young men who don't feel seen, who may have mental health issues. They need the support to ensure that they're not radicalised, because whether they're white or whether they're black or whether they're Muslim, they're always of the same group. They're looking for community. They're looking for an answer. So something is failing this group of men, and I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer other than to say a range of measures are needed to make sure that these men don't find a purpose in violence. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.